A wealthy woman entered the cafe with the kind of confidence that only comes from privilege. Her high heels clicked sharply against the polished floors, and her designer handbag swung with every step. She took her eyes scanned the room briefly before settling on a table by the window. She walked past the other customers without so much as a glance or acknowledgement of the people around her. Her gaze was fixed on the waitress, standing behind the counter, a young black woman who was busy preparing drinks and taking orders. The wealthy woman approached the counter with an air of superiority that seemed to radiate from her. She barely looked at the young woman as she spoke, her voice carrying a demanding tone that made it clear she was used to being served immediately. She waved a hand dismissively toward the menu board overhead and said in a sharp voice, "I'll have a cappuccino, and make it fast." The waitress turned to her with a polite smile and replied, "I'm so sorry, ma'am. We are a bit busy right now, but it will only be a few minutes before we can get to your order." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly as if she couldn't believe she was being told to wait. How dare she suggest that someone of her status should wait, she thought in her mind. How could someone like this young woman expect her to wait? She was a paying customer after all. Her eyes flicked up and down the waitress, assessing her with judgmental eyes, as if deciding whether or not she was worth the effort to be served. She could already sense the annoyance building in the woman's posture as her arms crossed over her chest, her lips tightening with frustration. "Do you know who I am?" the woman snapped, her tone now dripping with condescension. The waitress hesitated for a moment before calmly answering, "I'm so sorry, ma'am. Like I said, we're just a little backed up at the moment, but I'll get to you as soon as possible." This calm response only seemed to agitate the wealthy woman further. She stood there for a few moments, silently seething, her fingers tapping impatiently on the countertop. She looked around at the other customers in the cafe, as if seeking validation for her displeasure. She let out a loud sigh that seemed to echo through the space. The tension in the air became palpable as the young waitress tried to continue her work without making things worse. The woman took a deep breath before leaning in closer to the counter and speaking again, her words cutting through the air with an icy edge. "Do you really expect me to wait any longer? I don't have all day. This is completely unacceptable." The waitress kept her calm demeanor and said, "I'm truly sorry, ma'am, but it won't be much longer." The woman's frustration was now clearly visible. She shot the waitress a look that seemed to dare her to say something else, but the waitress remained silent. The cafe was buzzing with the low hum of conversation and the clinking of dishes, but the confrontation between the two women seemed to have frozen time around them. The other customers glanced nervously at one another, wondering how long this was going to last. The woman stood at the counter glaring at the waitress, her posture rigid and filled with a silent fury. She was used to being the one in control, used to having things done exactly as she commanded. She could feel the anger rising in her chest, her patience thinning. The situation was quickly becoming unbearable for her. It was a simple request. After all, she couldn't understand why it was taking so long. The woman stood there for a moment, her breathing becoming shallow, her eyes locked on the waitress, who was still calmly moving about preparing drinks, as if nothing was wrong. The tension in the air grew thick around them, and the wealthy woman's annoyance only seemed to deepen. The young waitress remained unshaken, her hand steady as she went about her tasks, but the woman's gaze never left her. Every movement the waitress made was scrutinized. The rich woman's mind raced. She couldn't believe this was happening. She had been so clear in her request. Why was it taking so long to get a simple cappuccino? Did they not realize who she was? How dare they treat her this way? She had never been kept waiting before, not for anything or anyone. She was important. She had money. She had influence. She was used to people jumping at her commands without question. She was someone who expected to be catered to immediately. The idea that someone would question her authority or ask her to wait made her blood boil. She took another deep breath, trying to calm herself. But the more she thought about it, the more her frustration bubbled to the surface. She had been nothing but polite at first, and now this, she couldn't understand it. She was starting to feel as if the young waitress was deliberately ignoring her, no doubt thinking she was just another customer, someone beneath her, someone who could be disregarded. She could feel her heart rate increase with every passing second. The seconds turned into minutes, and the line behind her began to grow longer. The rich woman glanced at the other customers. She could see the judgment in their eyes. They were watching her, and she could feel them whispering about her. She could feel her status slipping away with every passing moment. How could they look at her like this? She thought, how could they assume she was just like any other person waiting for their coffee in a crowded cafe? She was different, she was special, she was above this. The whispers in the cafe became louder as the rich woman's impatience grew. She looked over at the young waitress, once again, who was still calmly going about her work, her face neutral, her expression unreadable. The woman opened her mouth, ready to speak again, to demand faster service. But before she could say a word, the waitress finally turned to her and spoke again in the same calm voice. "I'm sorry for the wait, ma'am. But like I said earlier, it will be just a few more minutes. I really appreciate your patience." It wasn't the response the wealthy woman had been expecting. She wasn't looking for politeness. She wasn't looking for understanding. She wanted action. She wanted her coffee right now. The words seemed to fall flat, and she couldn't suppress the wave of irritation that flooded her chest at this point. She couldn't even remember the last time she had been treated this way. She had grown so accustomed to being in control, to being the one who had the final say, that the simple act of waiting was now a personal affront. The rich woman felt something snap inside her. She had reached her breaking point. She wasn't going to stand there any longer waiting like some ordinary person. She wasn't just any customer. She was someone who deserved respect. She was someone who demanded attention. She couldn't stand the idea of being ignored for one more second. And so in a split second, she made a decision, a rash and thoughtless decision that would change everything. The rich woman's face twisted with frustration as her patience snapped. She couldn't take it anymore. Without thinking, she reached for her cup of steaming coffee, and in one swift motion, she hurled it toward the waitress. The hot liquid splashed across the young woman's uniform, sending a shockwave through the cafe. The sound of the coffee hitting its target was drowned out by the gasps of the other customers who had witnessed the entire scene. The woman stood there frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. The waitress gasped as the hot coffee burned her skin. But she didn't scream, she didn't flinch, she didn't even raise her voice. Instead, she stood still for a second, collecting herself, before quietly walking away from the counter. The wealthy woman blinked in disbelief. She had expected the waitress to react to the attack, to retaliate, to beg for her apology. But instead, the woman remained composed and dignified. The rich woman's anger only grew as she watched the waitress turn and walk calmly toward the back of the cafe. She stood there with her arms crossed, staring after her, seething with rage, her breath coming faster. Now she had humiliated her. She had thrown the coffee at her. And yet the waitress had not even given her the satisfaction of an emotional outburst. How dare she remain calm in the face of such treatment? Wasn't she supposed to show weakness? Wasn't she supposed to show some form of submission? The rich woman's thoughts spiraled with indignation. She had been so sure that throwing the coffee would force the waitress to apologize, or at the very least respond with some kind of fear. But instead, all she got was silence. It was the kind of silence that made her feel exposed. It made her feel small. It made her question her own actions. But she couldn't let herself feel guilt. She couldn't let herself feel sorry for what had happened. Not when she had been treated so poorly by this young woman. She glanced around the cafe, looking for the reactions of the other customers. They were all staring at her, some with shock, others with disapproval. There were murmurs of disbelief, spreading like wildfire among the people seated in the cafe. The rich woman's chest tightened as she realized the full weight of her actions. The shame she had hoped to avoid was now upon her. She could see the judgment in their eyes, and she hated it. She didn't want to feel exposed. She didn't want to feel like a villain. She wanted to retreat into the safety of her privilege. The customers whispered to one another, some with quiet outrage, some with disbelief at what they had just witnessed. The wealthy woman's eyes darted from one face to another, feeling the weight of their silent condemnation. She wanted to lash out at them too, to tell them all they didn't understand, but she knew it wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't undo the moment she had just created. She turned to face the counter again and found the young waitress had disappeared into the back of the cafe. She was gone, but the damage had been done. The wealthy woman took a shaky breath and tried to regain her composure, but she could feel her pulse racing, her palms were sweaty, and she could sense her reputation starting to slip away in front of her eyes. What had started as a minor inconvenience, a simple request for coffee, had spiraled into something much bigger than she had anticipated. The rich woman tried to collect herself, but the weight of the stairs and the quiet whispers in the cafe was too much to ignore. She knew she had made a mistake, but the question now was whether she could escape the consequences of her actions, or if karma would come knocking at her door. The moment felt like it had frozen in time. The rich woman stood there trying to steady herself. As the weight of her actions began to sink in, she could feel the eyes of the other customers burning into her, every second feeling the tension rise in the cafe. She looked around, hoping for some form of support, but there was none. There was only silence, and the lingering presence of judgment hanging in the air. She felt her breath catch in her throat, her hands trembled at her sides, and she wanted nothing more than to disappear, to run from the situation, and never look back. But she couldn't leave, not yet, not when she was the center of attention. Her mind raced with thoughts of how she could salvage the situation, how she could escape the scrutiny of those around her. But deep down she knew there was no easy way out. The damage had already been done, the video had already been captured, and now it was out of her control. The waitress had not reacted as expected, and that was making everything worse. The woman hadn't cried out, she hadn't screamed in pain or angered. No, the waitress had simply walked away without a word. Her calm composure in the face of the attack only seemed to fuel the woman's growing sense of unease. She had expected her to retaliate, she had expected her to react with fear or shame, but the silence was deafening, and it made the rich woman feel exposed. She could hear the soft murmurs of the customers now as they began to speak in hushed tones, some of them whispering to one another, some exchanging looks of disbelief at what they had just witnessed. She could feel their eyes on her, their judgment pressing down on her like an invisible weight. Her stomach twisted into knots, and for a moment she felt like she might faint. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She was supposed to be in control. She was supposed to be the one who set the tone in any situation. But now she was the one being judged. She was the one being scrutinized, and it terrified her. The reality of what she had done began to settle in her chest, and her heart started to race faster. With each passing second, her mind replayed the image of the waitress walking away without a single word, and it stung more than the coffee had ever stung her. She wanted to run, but she couldn't. She wanted to apologize, but her pride wouldn't let her. The conflict inside her grew louder and louder as she struggled to make sense of everything that had just unfolded. She felt small now, and it was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. Her wealth, her status, her influence, none of it seemed to matter anymore. She was just another person standing in a cafe facing the consequences of her actions. She glanced down at her coffee cup, which still sat on the counter, and she felt a strange emptiness. She hadn't expected to feel guilty. She hadn't expected to regret her actions. But now, as she stood there in the silence of the cafe with everyone's eyes on her, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her mistake. She could feel the eyes of the customers still on her, and she knew they were all thinking the same thing. What kind of person throws coffee at another person? No matter the circumstances, the truth hit her like a wave, and she realized that this wasn't just about the coffee. It was about the way she had treated the young waitress, the way she had assumed her privilege would protect her from any consequence. And now it was all unraveling before her eyes. The woman stood frozen in place, her pride battling with the growing shame that threatened to swallow her whole. She knew deep down that she couldn't undo what had just happened, but she didn't know how to move forward. Either the realization that she had been wrong was sinking in, but it felt like too little too late. The wealthy woman stood there frozen, still gripped by the weight of her own actions, her mind spiraling as she tried to process what had just happened. But it felt as though the walls of the cafe were closing in on her. The whispers grew louder, and the stares more intense. She felt the heat of their judgment burning into her skin, and for the first time in a long while she felt utterly powerless. She glanced around the cafe, trying to find a way to escape the suffocating tension, but there was no way out, no simple exit from the situation she had created. Her heart raced in her chest, her hands still trembling at her sides, and her mind was a blur of thoughts too fast to catch. She felt small, exposed, vulnerable in a way she had never experienced before, and it terrified her. She had spent years building a life of luxury and privilege, convinced that her wealth and status could shield her from the consequences of her actions. But now here she was facing the fallout of a momentary lapse in judgment, and it was unraveling everything she had worked for. She turned back to the counter, but the young waitress was no longer there. The woman had disappeared into the back of the cafe without a word, without a glance, and the rich woman felt a pang of guilt that cut deeper than anything she had felt before. She couldn't shake the image of the waitress calmly walking away from the scene without saying anything. It was like a slap in the face. Her pride had been bruised in a way she had never imagined possible. Her eyes shifted to the other customers who were still watching her. Some of them seemed to have their phones out, and she could feel the dread rise within her. She knew what was happening. The scene had already been recorded, and it was only a matter of time before it would spread to social media like wildfire. She wanted to stop it, to delete the video, to erase it all. But she knew she couldn't. She knew it was too late. The damage had been done. She looked around the room again, hoping for some sign of sympathy, hoping for someone to step in and defend her. But no one spoke up. No one came to her aid. The silence in the cafe was deafening except for the soft murmur of people speaking in hushed tones. She could hear their words floating through the air, but she couldn't make them out. She felt as though she were drowning in the sea of judgment and shame that surrounded her. She wanted to yell at them, to defend herself, to explain that they didn't understand the pressure she had been under, but she couldn't. She couldn't find the words. Her mind was too clouded with the weight of her own actions. The reality of what she had done began to hit her like a wave crashing over her. She had thrown coffee at another person. She had humiliated the young waitress in front of everyone. And for what? To prove that she was in control, to prove that she could get away with anything. But now it was all unraveling. Her reputation was on the line, and she didn't know how to stop it. The rich woman could feel her face flush with embarrassment as the truth of the situation sank in. She had tried to use her status to bully someone into submission, but it had backfired in a way she couldn't have predicted. The worst part was that the young waitress had been the one to come out on top. She had not reacted with anger or fear. Instead, she had stood there with dignity and grace and walked away from the scene without a word. The rich woman had lost the battle before it had even begun, and now she was left standing there in the midst of her own defeat. The cafe around her felt suffocating, the air thick with the weight of the moment, and she realized that nothing she could do would ever undo what had just transpired. The rich woman stood there staring blankly at the counter, her mind racing, but no thoughts could make sense of what had just happened. She knew the video had been taken, and it was only a matter of time before it would go viral. But the realization hit her hard as the seconds dragged on, and her chest tightened with anxiety. She couldn't escape it. No matter how much she wanted to, her pride, her status, her reputation, everything she had built over the years was now at risk, all because of one moment of rage. She had lashed out, and now she was paying the price. She glanced around the cafe again, her eyes flicking nervously over the other customers. Some were still whispering to each other, while others were staring openly at her with judgment in their eyes. A few seemed to be pulling out their phones. Her heart dropped when she noticed a group of people recording the incident. She wanted to shout at them, to stop, to tell them to erase it, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stood there paralyzed by the enormity of what she had done. She had been so sure that she was untouchable, so convinced that her wealth and power could protect her from any consequence. But now she saw how fragile that illusion was. The rich woman's gaze shifted to the entrance of the cafe, where she saw a delivery person walking in with a new order. The bell above the door rang, and the sound broke her out of her daze. The silence in the room felt unbearable now, as though everyone in the cafe was waiting for something to happen, waiting for her to either make an apology or to somehow make the situation right. But she didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to fix it. She wanted to apologize to the waitress, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. Not yet, maybe not ever. Her pride was too wounded, and her fear of looking weak was stronger than her desire to do the right thing. She felt the weight of her own arrogance pressing down on her as she stood there, unable to move, unable to act. She had underestimated the power of a single moment, the power of a video, the power of social media. She had underestimated how quickly things could spiral out of control. The waitress had left the scene without a word, but she wasn't the one who needed to be saved now. The rich woman was the one in the hot seat, the one who had to face the consequences of her actions. She knew that the damage had already been done, But she couldn't help but wish she could rewind time to take back the impulsive decision to throw that coffee to somehow undo the hurt she had caused. But there was no going back. She was trapped in this moment, and it was too late to take it back. The rich woman pulled out her phone, her hands shaking slightly as she checked her notifications. And there it was. The video had already been posted on social media. The comments were flooding in with a mix of outrage and disbelief. Some were calling for her to apologize, others were condemning her behavior, and a few even questioned whether she was going to face any real consequences for her actions. Her heart sank as she scrolled through the posts. The public outrage was growing by the minute, and she knew it was only going to get worse. The video had spread faster than she could have imagined, and now everyone knew who she was. They knew her name, her face, and her actions, and she couldn't escape it. The rich woman's mind raced as she tried to figure out what to do next, but she couldn't think clearly. The situation was spiraling out of her control. The more she read the comments, the more she could feel her reputation being torn apart piece by piece. It felt like she was watching the destruction of everything she had built in real time, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The feeling of helplessness washed over her as the world around her shifted. She had thrown away her control in that one impulsive moment, and now the consequences were crashing down on her. The woman's mind was consumed by the storm of comments and the ever-growing buzz surrounding the video. She could feel her grip on everything slipping away, and no matter how much she tried to convince herself that it wasn't as bad as it seemed, she knew deep down that it was much worse than she had imagined. The humiliation was spreading faster than she could keep up with it. She scrolled through the posts, seeing her name splashed across countless news outlets and social media platforms. The outrage was palpable. People from all walks of life were expressing their disgust at her actions. Some were demanding she be held accountable for what they saw as a deliberate act of cruelty. Others were questioning her privilege and how she could think it was acceptable to treat another human being with such disdain. The comments weren't just about the coffee, they were about her. They were about the way she had treated the waitress, the way she had used her status to belittle someone else. And the more she read, the more she realized that the public wasn't going to let her escape this. They weren't going to just forgive her because she had money or because she had a fancy title. They weren't going to forget what she had done. And the more she scrolled, the more the weight of her mistake began to suffocate her. She couldn't escape it. There was no way to fix it. It was everywhere. People had seen it. People were talking about it. People were sharing it. She had become the face of entitlement and cruelty, and now she had to face the consequences of it. She put down her phone for a moment and tried to breathe through the panic that was rising inside of her. She could hear the murmur of voices in the cafe around her as people continued to whisper and point at her, and she realized that she was no longer a stranger to them. She was the villain of the story, the one they had all been waiting for her to fall from grace. They were watching her fall apart in real time, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She couldn't hide behind her money or her influence anymore. The world had seen her for what she truly was, and they weren't going to let her forget it. Her reputation was unraveling in front of her eyes. Her business was beginning to feel the impact of the public backlash, and she could already sense the ripples of consequence starting to spread into her personal life. 2 emails from her agents and business partners were pouring in with concerns about her image and her future opportunities disappearing one by one. Endorsements and partnerships that had once seemed secure were now beginning to dissolve as companies distanced themselves from the scandal. She could feel her entire world beginning to crumble. The wealthy woman had always prided herself on being untouchable. She had built her life on the foundation of influence and control, but now she realized how fragile that world really was. She had been so confident in her ability to avoid any real consequence, but this time it was different. This time she had crossed a line, and the world wasn't going to let her get away with it. She could already hear the whispers from her own social circle. The people who had once admired her were now turning away in disgust, and the isolation began to seep into her soul. She had expected to walk through life untouched by the struggles of others, to continue living as though the rules didn't apply to her. But now everything had changed. She was no longer the powerful woman in the room. She was the object of ridicule, the one who had let her privilege blind her to the humanity of others. And it was all because of a single moment of rage. The shame and guilt she felt were unbearable, and for the first time in her life, she was forced to confront the full weight of her actions. Her reputation was beyond repair, and she knew it would take much more than an apology to undo the damage she had caused. She couldn't take back what she had done, and the world was not going to forget it. The rich woman felt the weight of her downfall settle heavily on her shoulders as the days passed. She couldn't escape the constant reminder of what had happened. Her once pristine reputation was now a thing of the past, and the consequences of her actions were impossible to ignore. Every time she opened her phone, she was confronted with the damage the video had caused. It was everywhere. The headlines were unforgiving, and the comments only grew more vicious as time went on. She tried to shut it all out, but the reality kept seeping in, inescapable and relentless. She had gone from being admired to being despised, from being powerful to being the symbol of entitlement and cruelty. The backlash didn't just affect her career, it seeped into every part of her life. Her friends and colleagues had begun to distance themselves from her. Calls went unanswered, invitations were withdrawn, and even her family seemed uncomfortable around her. Her once comfortable world was now a place of isolation and loneliness. She had never known such a feeling before, and it gnawed at her every moment. The rich woman spent her days holed up in her mansion, staring at the walls, trying to figure out how to undo what she had done. But deep down, she knew it wasn't possible. The damage was too great, the anger too deep to erase in an instant. She had lost the trust of everyone around her, and no amount of money or power could change that. It was in this solitude that she began to reflect on her actions. The reality of the pain she had caused. The young waitress had stayed with her. She had been the one to remain calm, to walk away without a word, and the woman realized how wrong she had been. She had let her anger and privilege blind her to the humanity of the other person. She had taken out her frustrations on someone who didn't deserve it, someone who had been doing their job and trying to make a living, while she had been acting like she was above it all. She had let her status define her, and in doing so she had hurt someone who had done nothing to her. The guilt began to eat away at her, and for the first time in years she felt small, she felt weak, and she felt remorseful. She knew she couldn't undo the past, but she also knew she couldn't move forward without acknowledging the hurt she had caused. So she made a decision. She couldn't go back and change things, but she could try to make amends. She picked up her phone and reached out to the waitress. She didn't know where to start, but she had to try. She had to do something. She owed it to herself and to the other person to make things right. She composed a message of apology, acknowledging how wrong she had been and how deeply sorry she was for her actions. It wasn't enough, she knew that, but it was all she could do in that moment. After hitting send, she felt a wave of fear and vulnerability wash over her. As she waited for a response, she feared rejection. She feared that her apology wouldn't be accepted, but at least she had taken the first step towards accountability. A few hours later, the response came. The young waitress thanked her for the apology, but made it clear that the actions couldn't be forgotten, and that she had already moved on with her life. It wasn't an angry response, it was measured, calm, and understanding. It stung, but it was exactly what the woman needed to hear. It was a reminder that some wounds don't heal quickly, some mistakes are too deep to erase with a simple apology, but that didn't mean they were beyond redemption. The rich woman sat there reading the message over and over again, and for the first time in a long time she felt something real. She felt a glimmer of hope that maybe she could start rebuilding her life, not by trying to erase what she had done, but by acknowledging it, learning from it, and becoming a better person in the process. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and the consequences would follow her for a long time. But she had taken the first step toward change, and for the first time she understood what it meant to be truly humbled.